We go with lucky number 13, our last learning moment for this term, I expect anyway. And so we're just going to quickly discuss. I'd promised earlier on that we'd have a look at switching back to SQL Server. Remember, all of the tutorials by default when you start an MVC application, especially if you check off the option for the identity system to be included into the project template, then of course it's all set up with SQL Server, right? So we focused on switching to sqLite, and that's what we've been using mainly, as I say here, to avoid paying, right, the cost of having SQL Server when we actually get it published to Azure. Okay, so with that in mind, because we wanted to save all the credit from your educational account for other uses later on, we've just been using sqLite for everything as we go along. It's actually pretty straightforward in almost all cases to just go back to SQL Server, but there's a couple things to be aware of, differences, things that we actually had to take on as an issue now get kind of cleaned up. For example, data types, right? Remember, I had that same reference here when we were coming the other direction, talks about limitations of data types and migrations and so on. But basically, the things we run into the most are things like the timestamp field, the row version, right? We've had the pain in the rear end aspect of having to manually add our own, create our own, and add them triggers for the updating of row version, either insert or update, right? So that's something that's gone because SQL Server automatically looks after that for us. Other ones were like decimal and int64. Okay, in SQLite, they're stored in what is essentially a text style, and so that's why it was limited. You could use it for equality, check if something is equal to it, but it did not work for comparisons or sorting. So now that problem's gone. So we can just go ahead and use these decimal and so on to our heart's content and do order by and everything else. Another big difference was migrations, right? With SQL Server, we can have multiple migrations with incremental changes, right? What we've been doing with sqLite again is just every time we make a design change to the model for the whole application, we would have to delete the database, delete the model, the migrations, and then recreate the migration based on the new design. Well, now we can just do incremental changes and add a sequence or series of migrations and apply them going forward and backwards and so on, right? That way, we also don't really have to, because we don't have to drop and recreate the database, most of the data does not get disturbed. Now, there are some circumstances where things can go a little wonky, like obviously if you remove a property from an entity, well, that's going to delete a column from the table, so data will be removed. Other issues can come up. What you might have to deal with is, creating something that's not nullable, and of course, you got to find some way to provide values for it, and so on and so forth. But again, those are smaller issues. The basic thing is that, hey, with SQL Server and migrations, we can just keep on adding more and more. I will be fair, though, and mention right now that sometimes, over time, if you get a large number of migrations, you might be best off just to kind of wipe them out, take the current state of the model and make a new initial migration and start over again. But in any case, we'll be looking at that. Now, in terms of SQL Server itself, of course, there are a few choices that we have. By default, when we first set up our MVC projects, we were set to use the LocalDB version of SQL Server Express, right? It's very much a developer tool, okay? You wouldn't use it for production, really. And for numerous reasons. The thing about it that's really unique from every other, it's fairly new feature available for SQL Server, is that it's just automatically turned on when we need it and turned off when we don't. In other words, it's not a service that's running all the time, which is the normal way SQL Server is installed, right? So it's just like an executable that spins up when we need it. And that's one reason why you can't connect to a database with LocalDB unless, some app like Visual Studio is actually running, causing it to be active. So in our connection strings, that's where you'll see things like LocalDB. And by the way, this is a default name these days for the actual instance MS SQL LocalDB, right? So that would be part of the connection string. Now, the other thing is you may actually have access to a regular SQL Server. It could be Express version right up through to the different developer, enterprise, and so on. But in any case, it might be on your machine you're developing on or on the local area network, right? Or you could actually be connecting to Azure, SQL Azure database in the cloud. But pretty much all of them, it's just a matter of setting up the connection string. If you're installing or working with SQL Server installed either locally or on the LAN, kind of thing, something to be aware of is on any machine you can have one default instance of SQL Server running, but you can have as many named instances running on the same machine, right? SQL Server Express, when you install it, the default arrangement is for it to be named instance, named SQL Express, right? So the dot backslash refers to the current computer, the same computer you're on, and then SQL Express as a named instance. That's often all you need then at the beginning of your connection string if you're using a local version of SQL Express. And of course, if it's on the network, then it gets, a little bit just having the path through the network and so on in place, and away you go. All right, now when you're working within Visual Studio, there's two different tools. There's Server Explorer, and that can be used to connect to any of the databases running on a SQL Server service, right? There's also the SQL Server Object Explorer. And you can actually get to most of the servers with this way as well, but it also gives us access to databases running on LocalDB. So we're going to get into this little demo. To prepare for this, I just downloaded the latest app we were working on there, that Art House, the Project One solution that's posted. It doesn't matter much whether we're doing a web API or an MVC, it works the same way in both. So I have a bit of a copy paste file here, some instructions to follow generally speaking, but I have the project open. And in my little prep steps there, one of the first things I mentioned is that I want to change. I kind of got lazy here with my copy paste. This schema, right? It's ignored with SQLite, so I haven't been very diligent here at keeping on top of this. I just copied and pasted this code over. So I want to change this to something instead of MO for medical office. I don't know, art seems to make sense as a schema. So I'm going to leave that in place as art because we're going to actually see the value or the usefulness of a schema with SQL Server. Okay, so that's just to prepare. And I had stripped out all the extra code here in the connection strings. So I'm just going to kind of put back a few different options so we can switch easily back and forth. So this is right from my copy paste file. Notice we did this earlier on. We would comment it. The idea is you could switch between different databases, right? So this is the one for SQLite. So I'm going to right away comment that one out. The first one here is with using LocalDB. So I'm going to put that one in place for now. Actually, no, I think I'm going to do the actual SQL Express. Yeah. So I only have one connection string, Arthouse context is the name. And this one is using my SQL Express, the service SQL service that's running locally on the machine that I'm developing on here right now. It's a named instance called SQL Express. Database, okay, whatever you want the name there to be. Now, of course, when this code actually is initially scaffolded, it uses a big GUID type thing to make sure database names are unique. You're free to leave it that way or change it as long as you do make sure it is still unique, you're good, right? Trusted connection, that just means we're going to use the built-in authentication in Windows because I'm on a Windows machine. And the MARS, multiple active result sets, just means if a select query returns multiple different result sets, they can all be returned at once. Okay, so that's the change there. So those are the two kind of preparatory steps I had to make, right? So what's the real key here? Well, remember what we did is we came in here and we changed this. It said use SQL Server. We changed it to use SQLite. Big surprise. All I do is go .use SQL Server, right? And as long as this connection string is properly set up, and it is right now, to use SQL Server, then that's it. I'm good, okay? So what I want to do next is come over here. Now I've got my art migrations, but this was set up for SQLite. So I might as well just delete this. Notice the database is still here. I'm not going to use it, so I could delete it as well. Wouldn't have to, but I could, right? And let me just open my common commands here again. So this command actually will work just as it is. If I come down here and open the Package Manager console, right? And I can just use the exact same command here. Now, by the way, to be fair, this dash context option, this is absolutely necessary when you have more than one DB context in a project, as we usually did with an MVC. Here, I only have one, so that's really optional. I don't have to specify this, but on the other hand, it's not going to hurt anything. One thing I will maybe mention is this output directory, right? I'm specifying that the first time, so it starts creating them in this one location within the solution. Uh, that's optional. I don't need to, it doesn't hurt again, but I don't need to include that again once I've started the initial migration. And by the way, the word initial is just arbitrary. I mean, just what a lot of developers use, and you'll see the online tutorials use it as well. So we'll do a build, okay? And then there we go. So it has scaffolded the migration, but it is done, of course. There's not going to be much different. Feel free to have a look, but you won't see a lot of changes here from how it would have been done for SQLite. Okay, but let's come back here. My next command might be to actually update database. And drum roll. Taking a little longer, it's got to connect to the service and so on. There it is done. Okay, now where can I see that then? Well, if I go under view, I can go to Server Explorer, right? Put my glasses on here. So Server Explorer right there, right? So right now I can add a new connection, okay? I'm going to use the SQL Server client. Server name is /SQL Express. Yeah. Actually, I didn't need to refresh, but anyway, there we go. All right, so if I click the drop-down list of databases, there it is there, Arthouse SQL, right? So this will create a connection in here to the database through the Server Explorer, and then I can come in, I can examine the tables, right? Views, stored procedures, look at all this extra stuff. You didn't really have these options with SQLite, did you, right? So now I have everything. By the way, this migration history, that's how it tells, right? We touched on that before. That there's been a model change, okay, in your model compared to the current design of the database. But there we go. So we could come in here. I could have a look. Of course, there's no data in it yet because I haven't run, right? Let's go ahead and run it. Now, I might have to run it twice here because sometimes it takes that second time to actually kick in and actually create all the data in my seed. Oh, no, it worked right away. I forgot this was the API. There we go. So if I come back here to the Server Explorer, I'll just refresh. And then now I should actually see the data here. I can right click, show table data, and there it is, right? So there's all my data right in the database. So as I saw even when it was up on the screen. So good, there we are. So we have it running on SQL Server. All there is to that, right? So let's see what we can do with these migrations. So I'll just close this. Actually, I'm going to close all this stuff for now. All right, when we come down here, I'm going to make a design change now. So let's come in here. I don't know, artwork. And I'm going to steal a bit of code, throw in a new property here. I'll call it impressions. Maybe we're going to, write some big long comment, a sentence or so about my impressions of the artwork. And there we go. Okay, so here's my new impressions of the model. I've added that. Now, of course, that's in the artwork class. And to do this properly, I should add it to the DTO and so on and so forth. But I'm just trying to show how migrations work, right? So if I come back to the package manager console, we know this from previous, I can use the up arrow to go back through previous commands. So I'm going to say add migration. Okay, remember I said this is optional. I don't need that anymore. Don't even technically need the context specification. Now I can't make another one called initial, right? It'll complain because I can't have two migrations with the same name. So usually you'll describe something about the change you've made. So I might say added impressions. So now you see it's looked at the current state, the changes to the model, and it's written a new migration with just the changes that are required to bring the database in line with our current model, right? So basically adding our impressions column. And of course, the down would be to drop the column, right? See, we've never really played around with targeting to a given migration because we've only ever had one with SQLite. But now we'll see that we can actually have a series of migrations. So let me just update database again. And there we go. So now the database has been updated. Now, mind you, to actually do anything with my new impressions column, as I said, we'd probably need to add it to our DTO. We'd need to add it to any other places where it's referenced and so on in particular. And if you're in an MVC application where you have views and all that, well, then you have to add new input controls so they can type a value and input for it and so on, right? So you're not done just because you've added a new column. But I'm just showing how now you see up here under Art Migrations, right? Now there's two separate migrations, our initial and our added impressions. Now we didn't need to worry about, even though there's row versions here, right? For example, in artwork, okay? Uh, pardon me, we're inheriting from Audible, so we're getting our row version from that. And that's why we actually manually added it into the DTO object, right? So where are the triggers? We don't need them, okay? It automatically looks after it for us and it's fully functional. But we did see that those extra migration steps could be useful sometimes for adding something like a view, right? How would we go about something like that? Taking this sort of multiple step-by-step migration approach. Well, essentially, now that I'm synchronized again, my database is in line with my actual uh, model design, all I'd have to do is add another migration, right? And it should be an empty migration. So this one, I'll give it a name. Now, some people, because if you ever, it's kind of a school of thought that you should never go in and muck around in the code of the actual automatically generated migrations, because if you ever want to start over and regenerate them, you don't want to lose something that, you stuck in there. The exception in this case is what we'll usually do is we want to create with some actual SQL commands, features inside the database, then do it in its own migration. And you might want to actually put something at the beginning of the name of the migration to help you when you look at all your migrations to see that this was a manual one or self-created or something like that. So I might call it man, and then add view. Now, it will create it, but of course it's empty. It's empty, and that makes sense because right now our model matches, right, the actual database design. There's nothing missing out of either side of that relationship. But I can use this to actually add some code similar to what we did in our extra migration steps, right? So let's say I want to add a view here. It's a summary, right, called art inventory. Okay, now remember, art is the um, schema for all the objects in our production tables, right? So I'm basically selecting the type of art, okay, a count of how many artworks there are in each type, and a sum of the value, okay, as total value of the artworks in each type. So we have to have the group by of the type, and of course our from clause has the two tables with a join, right, between them on the primary foreign key relationship between them. Okay, so that's good for the up, but we have to be much more careful now about the down. We always need to, in order to use migrations properly, we have to supply the code for the down as well. So to reverse that step would be simply drop view, right? So that way we can apply the step and we can roll it back. Okay, so I'll just save those changes here, right? And I'll once more update database. Okay, there we go. If I come over here to the Server Explorer, let me just refresh here, right? Then I'll see we've added our view, right? Now, one of the neat things about migrations this way is I can target. Okay, I can target a given migration, and that way you can kind of roll back and roll forward through the different design changes you've made, right? So here I could say, no, you know what? I want to roll back before I added the view. So the one I want to go back to is my one here, added impressions, right? So I could do that. I can go back and roll back to that one by simply saying update database dash migration and then the name of the migration. Now, for the name, I can actually, you can just use the whole name, including the timestamp, and that works. Or some people, especially if you're typing it manually, would prefer to just use the name portion that they generated. Both work, okay? So that's one reason why they have to be unique. So this way, it's actually going to roll back. It'll apply the down in my migration that you see on the screen there. And so if I refresh the database over here, the view is now gone, right? Because we dropped it by rolling back one, right? You can go right back to the initial, okay? And so on and so forth. In fact, if you say dash migration 0, it always takes you right back to your very first migration. So there's, just to show you how you can step forward through and move back through different migrations. You can skip steps. You don't have to go one at a time. It'll just apply them in the order, right? Now, the order, of course, somewhat comes from this timestamp as well. That's how the system knows the order that the migrations have been created in, right? It's not the name, it's the actual timestamp portion of the name here that helps it to keep straight on that. But anyway, that's a quick example then of how you can implement with SQL Server, multiple migration steps every time you make a change. So if we wanted to do something else, maybe we're going to drop. Okay, well, not much to drop in here. We only have type, right? But maybe we're going to make another change, uh, and so on. Then we can just add more and more migrations, and away you go. Now let's just see though. We've did all this using uh, SQL Server, right? Let's say we want to change now, and I want to use instead the LocalDB version. Well, let me comment out my connection string for the SQL Server service running, my SQL Server Express, and we'll put this one in play, right? There we go. Do I have to recreate my migrations? No, because they're totally compatible. LocalDB as a version of SQL Express is totally compatible with the regular version, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just save that. And if I come down here, all I have to do is say update database. Oh, yeah. Just to prove it, I'll take this out this time. Just update database is good enough. There we go. Oh, okay. My apologies. I got caught because I practiced the demo once and I'd already created the database once. So without the database there, now I just went in and I deleted it. And I'll show you how I did that in a second. But I just want to show you that's what caused the problem. Now all I did, I haven't changed the migrations at all. I just deleted the database. So now it has a chance to create it fresh and apply all 3 migrations in series to bring the database up to date. And there it is done. Now to see the database now, what I have to do, I can't get it with the Server Explorer because it's not a service that's running, but they provided the SQL Server Object Explorer, right? And with this, okay, you see we have access to different, and we can actually still get to our SQL Server Express this way, right? This is another option to get there because it'll do both in a sense. But this gives us access to, I have to refresh. There is my Art House LocalDB, right? So that's the one that I've just created here. That's the name I used in that particular connection string, right? Just to help me see that this is the one for LocalDB. So there's my tables, right? And I should have my view as well, right? Because remember, it would have applied all 3 of the migrations in order, starting with the initial added impressions and our manual add view, right? So it is totally up to sync, and there won't be any data in those tables yet. Let me just show you that. So if I come here to Artworks, view data, nothing there. But if I run it, it should seed, and we're right back to a fully functioning system. And sure enough, if I refresh, View data, actually just view data would have worked, but anyway, there we see our data has been seeded in. So, right, so that's how easy it was to even switch from one SQL Server to another, so to speak, right? And now we don't have to recreate our migrations. I just have to make sure there's not a database existing, so the migrations can all be applied in order. Now, I promised I'd show you how I deleted the database, right? That's quite simple in here. I just right click and delete, going through the SQL Server Object Explorer. By the way, you often have to click this close existing connections because it won't let you delete it if it sees a connection, and we're connected. So there we go. And now it will delete it. So that's pretty much the end of my demo, right? So that's pretty much all you have to do.